Hey, what's up, guys? It's the Flight Sim CFI here, and thank you for tuning into the second installment of our private pilot license in the Flight Sim. My name is Dave. I am a CFI in the real world, and I wanted to bring some of that knowledge here to the Flight Sim to the eager enthusiasts that wanted to learn a little bit more, in depth of their and build on their flying abilities within the Flight Sim. So today we've got a pretty theoretical lesson called Flight for Range and Endurance. Now, in the simulator, is it something that you're really going to do too much of? Maybe not, unless you're doing a lot of GA flying. But the principles behind attitudes and movements are really important with all flying to understand how certain forces, how certain things act on the aircraft, and how it will respond in different ways. Outside of just our controls, our controls meaning like our elevator control and our aileron control. This is when we bring in some of the ancillary controls that will help us fly for longer, whether it be for longer distance or for longer time. And when you even get up into using the airlines in this, it'll also teach you kind of how much fuel you'll need. Now you'll have to calculate that different ways, and we're kind of going to get into a little bit in depth, or we're getting too far in depth into that. I'm not going to touch that at all. We're just going to stick strictly with GA, where we can really mess around with our mixture controls, our cruise power settings, and to get the most out of our aircraft. So if you're wanting to do a nice like cross-country flight in the airplane, then we know how much fuel we need to take to carry the minimum amount of fuel so we can carry the maximum amount of people. Because in real world, you got to remember that if we take full tanks of fuel, now my useful load's going down in general aviation, where we only have maybe a 700, 800, 900 pound useful load. If you don't know what useful load is, that is your total load with all of your people, your baggage, your fuel, all of that fully loaded. So not including your usable oil and your non-usable fuel. So anyways, without further ado, let's hop over to the PowerPoint. I'm setting this up a little different. If you watched part one, this is going to be totally different. I'm really going to go down to how we would teach this kind of in real world. So we'll go through a little bit of a PowerPoint. I'm going to skim over some things. We're not going to go too crazy, but I want to focus on one topic on each video, so it's easier for you guys to find if you want to go to attitudes and movements, or you want to go to stalls, you want to go to steep turns, whatever the case may be. So without further ado, let's go over to the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll go from there. All right, guys, so here we are. We are in Flight for Range and Endurance, and when we see on our friend's screen here, I don't know if any of you have seen this story, but it's a great representation of what Flight for Endurance is. This was a Cessna 172, flew around in the middle of the desert for, I believe it was 56 days. Didn't really go very far, flew within a couple nautical miles of itself, but flew for an astronomical amount of time. Now, a normal Cessna 172 can fly for 5 or 6 hours, depending on how it's loaded, and really light load with tons of fuel. Perfectly leaned mixture, you could fly for about 5 or 6 hours. But 56 days between two pilots up there, and this is how they got fuel. You can see that line coming down. That's how they were refueling. I'm not too sure. I believe that they were, using the washroom inside the airplane and then essentially throwing it down into the desert. So it was an interesting story, but that would be endurance. And the other side of that would be range. Well, what do we think range might be? So ask yourself, well, if endurance is how long we can fly based on time, what would the range be? And if you guess that range would be how far we can fly, that would be right. There's a little bit more to it, but range, how many nautical miles we can fly, and endurance, how long can we fly for? Time doesn't matter if we go 1 nautical mile or 1,000. Endurance is all about time. So let's go here, and we'll go to our agenda for today. So we're going to we're not going to review any of our steep climbs and descents and turns. We went through that in the last video. If you want to go back through that, you can do that on your own there. We'll go through our objectives for today. What is Flight for Range and Endurance? So we'll go over that as well. We'll go over the 4 forces of flight. We'll go over range itself in a little more detail, endurance, and then we'll review everything. Safety, I'm not really going to worry too much about safety. And questions, this is just going to tell you that if you have any questions, make sure you put them down in the comments below. I'll try to get to them as soon as possible. If I can't get to it in the comments section and give you an adequate answer, I'm going to make a Q&A video so we can touch base on all of that. So the link of this is our attitudes and movements. That was in the last video, so if you haven't seen that, I'll retitle it so it kind of goes in line with these. But attitudes and movements, straight and level flight, and climbing, descents, and turns is all in the part 1 of the private pilot flight sim lessons here. So a few things that we'll go over first is how do we enter and exit a climb. So if you remember from the last one, there's a mnemonic that we use whenever we enter or exit a climb. And it differs from entering or exiting a descent. And this doesn't matter whether you are flying in a general aviation aircraft or flying in an airliner. We use this mnemonic, and I'll remind you of it here, is APT, or attitude, power, trim. So if we want to enter a climb, the first thing that we do is we put our attitude to the desired attitude, we add our power, and then we trim as required. If we want to exit the climb, then what we do is we put our attitude forward, we pull back our power, and we trim as accordingly. I always remember, if you want to climb, you climb up the apartment, right? The next one is how do we enter and exit a descent? And that one, self-explanatory, is, not going to be the same as the APT. We want to go to PAT, so power, attitude, trim. So we pat the dog. We bend down to pat the dog, right? So PAT, power, attitude, trim. And we want to remember this through all of our flying. So if we want to descend, we pull the power back, and then we set our attitude, and then we trim as required. Next question, to kind of get the brain primed up and ready to go. In straight and level flight, how can we increase airspeed without changing our altitude? So how do you think, if we're flying, we're at 4,000 feet in straight and level flight, how do you think we can increase our airspeed without changing our altitude? Because we know if power affects our altitude and pitch affects our airspeed, how can we do the two? Because if we just lower our nose, if we're in straight and level flight, what's going to happen? We're going to accelerate, but we're also going to descend. Okay, so what if we just add power and keep our nose the way it is? Well, then we're going to climb, might hold the same airspeed, but if we held exactly at the same thing, we might increase, might decrease, depending on what we do with our attitude. So in straight and level flight, if we want to increase our airspeed without changing our altitude, there's two things that we want to do. Is we want to add our power, and we want to lower the nose. Okay, so sometimes when we have to look at the reaction to our action, right? So what we were explaining before, if we're in straight and level flight and I add power, it's just going to make us climb. If we just pull the nose up, or if we push the nose down, to increase our airspeed, we're just going to start descending. So we have to use the two in conjunction with each other to get the outcome. And the best way to remember this, if you forget from the last video, is the performance formula. Think of this in anything that you do. Whoa. My key just stuck on me there. Let's go back here. Let's keep going. Attitude plus power equals performance. So what we want is performance. We want something, right? And how are we going to get that? Attitude. So we fix our attitude to what we want, our power to what we want, and then we'll get our performance. All right. So our objectives today, we want to learn. We're going to cover the greatest, learn how to cover the greatest distance per unit of fuel consumed, and how to stay in the air the longest time per unit of fuel. So if you had to think of which, these two are range and endurance, which one's range and which one's endurance? Ask yourself that. Okay, well, when we talked about it at the beginning, the guy flying around in circles in the desert, what was that? That was endurance. So we wanted to, was that cover the greatest distance per unit of fuel consumed, or is that staying in the air for the longest time per unit of fuel consumed? And I see I've got a little typo there. I can fix that. Consumes, it's consumed. So If you said stay in the air for the longest time per unit of fuel consumed, then you're right. Remember we said at the beginning, endurance is time, range is distance. So what is flight for range and endurance? Well, we just went over there. Flight for range is the greatest distance possible for unit of fuel consumed. And that's the big thing, that unit of fuel consumed is what it's based on, okay? Because every plane differs, right? You think, look at this, C5 in the background. If it's empty, it can fly for 7,000 miles, okay? So really light, tons of time on a tank of fuel. Flight for endurance, what we were talking about just a second ago, is the maximum length of time an aircraft may remain airborne for a given power setting and fuel available, right? And again, that's just time. It's not based on distance, doesn't matter how far. So here's going to give us the information there that I was trying to recall, the 172 in Las Vegas Desert for 64 days, 22 hours, and 19 minutes. Okay. Now, in order to understand range and endurance, flight for range and endurance, we have to understand the basic four forces of flight. So I want you to look at this and tell me, you pause the video and try to tell me each of the four forces acting on the aircraft during flight. So we'll start here. At the bottom is weight. So gravity or weight, some people will call it gravity, and that's fine. But that's the weight pulling down on our aircraft. I don't have my airplane here, but we'll use my drone, okay? I have my drone. So weight is what's pulling it down. It's what's sitting it in my hand, actually, sitting in this position. Now, what counters weight? What goes up? That would be lift. So if we have weight, what counters that is lift, okay? And at an equal weight to lift ratio, we're going to be hovering, essentially, if we're not talking about the next two forces. But just if you think of a helicopter, when they have the same amount of lift as weight, they're just going to hover in one spot. Now, the next force, what pushes us forward? What pushes us forward? That would be thrust. And we get the thrust from the engines or the jets or the prop, whatever, depending on the aircraft that we're using. And what counteracts our thrust? That would be our drag. And there's many forms of drag, and we'll go into that, but drag is the really the byproduct of lift, and just being a unit that's flying through the air, you're going to have drag at all times, right? So if we match that thrust to drag ratio, then we're going to be in unaccelerated flight, and whether we're at 1 knot or 1,000 knots, if you're flying a fighter, and that if it's equal, you're going to hold the same airspeed. So we have best range here. So best range, this is called the drag curve. Okay, and I was talking about the two different types of drag. We have induced drag and parasite drag. And so what you can see here is we have our induced drag with the increase in airspeed with an increase in airspeed, our drag goes down, an induced drag. Now, do we know what induced drag is versus parasite drag? Induced drag is drag that is a byproduct of lift. Parasite drag are things like landing gear. Landing gear doesn't help us fly, really. Helps us land, but it doesn't help us fly. So that's considered parasite or parasitic drag. And you can see with parasite drag, as our airspeed increases, our drag increases. And this gives us our total drag curve. Now you're going to say, Dave, why do I need to know this? What does this have to do with me? Have to do with best range. So so we want to be getting our greatest distance with that, okay? So we need to know the drag curve, and we need to know these. So we went over the parasite and induced drag, and we need to find the sweet spot in the middle where we have the best lift to drag. So where would we say that is on this curve? Probably around the 80 knots. So we can expect in this situation with this aircraft that at about 80 knots, we are going to be in that sweet spot, okay? So the rule of thumb for this is 1.5 times the power off stall speed, okay, which we'll learn more about that later, but 1.5 times the power off stall speed at max gross weight is going to be that sweet spot, okay? So if we take, and I'll just pull out my calculator here. Well, 1.5. Okay, like so let's say 60 knots. My 177 is about 60 knots of a power off stall speed. So we can look at about 90 knots is going to be around that sweet spot for us. Okay. Okay, so there's a few factors, and you can probably tell by the image here that are going to affect our range. So if we let's look at the top here, okay? No air's moving, very still air. We're flying at 120 knots. Ground speed's 120 knots. Now we got an air moving behind us, pushing us. We're still flying 120 knots airspeed, but our ground speed is 20 knots. The air pushing us is 20 knots, which is going to give us a ground speed of 140 knots. It's pushing us an extra 20 knots. You got to think, when you're in an airplane, you're like a leaf. We're so used to being on the ground, air hits us and goes around us. In the air pushes us, right? We have to have that differentiate. So if we have 20 knots pushing to the side of us, it's pushing us sideways 20 knots. It's not going around us. Okay, so when we get into crazy crosswinds, we'll learn how to counteract that. But if we're talking straight headwind, straight tailwind, we have 20 knots pushing us from behind. That pushes us to a ground speed of 140 knots. And if the air is coming head on at 20 knots, then we lose 20 knots, ground speed of 110 knots. So back to this, factors impacting our range. What do we think could impact our range? Well, we obviously know that the wind can, but there's some other things. What do we need to fly longer? What's one thing that we can put into our aircraft that makes us fly for a longer distance? That would be fuel. We want to drive our car and we want to drive 1 hour. We might need 8 liters of fuel. But let's say we need to drive 500 kilometers. We might need 40 liters of fuel or 50 liters of fuel, right? So fuel is one thing that can help us fly longer. Angle of attack, the greatest lift to drag ratio. So remember what we just talked about, that drag curve. That's the greatest lift to drag ratio. And we base it off of airspeed because not all aircraft have an angle of attack indicator. But what we're finding is that best angle of attack to cause the least amount of drag on the aircraft to make it work less and fly longer. The next speed is our airspeed. So it's an indirect relationship to the AOA, what we were just talking about there. And if you ever see AOA, that's just angle of attack, okay? The next thing, weight. Aircraft weight, more lift is required. If we're super, super heavy, and you'll feel it if you ever transition from the flight simulator into the real world, when you load up that aircraft, it feels like it's just bogging down. If you're at the highest weight possible, it's going to require more thrust, right? Because remember, with more weight, we need more lift. And with more lift, we have more drag. So all these things work together and work for and against each other to make the aircraft fly. The next thing is our weight and balance. If we have 2 300-pound macho guys sitting in the front of the airplane, it's going to perform differently than you have a 175-pound guy in the front, or even 2 of them and a kid in the back, right? More distributed weight. Even though it's both 600 pounds of weight of people, it's distributed differently. The aircraft will fly differently, okay? Next thing, altitude. Time. So if we need to climb, that takes time, that takes fuel. Weather changes as we climb, and our engine performance changes. So all of those things can make us fly further or not as far. Best endurance. So what we're talking about, the greatest length of time an aircraft can stay airborne for a given amount of fuel. So what power setting would give us more endurance versus less endurance? So what do we think? More endurance. What power setting? We're not worried about how far we go, so we don't really care too much about the speed per se. We only care about the speed to know that we're at the best power setting. But really, we're going to base this all off of the engine instruments as opposed to the airspeed. But what power setting will give us the most endurance? So more endurance? If we had a lot of power in, would we be using more fuel? You got that throttle down on the highway, trying to speed up and hold a high speed on the highway. Is that taking more fuel or less fuel? So that would take more fuel, obviously. So more endurance, we need a lower power setting. So The adverse of that is less endurance, higher power settings. So we need to know that we need to have a lower power setting in this, but we still need to fly. So we have to find that sweet spot of where we can get the power back, still maintain straight and level flight. Obviously, if we have more weight, like we were talking about, we have more drag, so we want to have less weight if at all possible. And the one big thing here is the mixture, and we'll go into that today, what the mixture is and how we can get more endurance out of it. The wind doesn't affect endurance in this situation because we're not worried about how far we fly. So we could have 100 knot headwind and be flying at 100 knots, let's say, and we're not moving at all. And that makes no difference. So the next thing, we'll kind of glance. Oh gosh, it's doing it again. Okay, let's go back here. It's my keyboard is resting on something, and it's just causing everything to stick. Let's just swap these over. Swap screens. Okay, here we are. So this here, this is just we're not going to go too far into depth with this chart. This is just a performance chart. But what I wanted to point out here is you look at their different power settings. So 45, 55, 65, and 75% of our power. If you want to go into, you like to nerd out and go through these things, you can pull up a POH for whatever aircraft you're using in the sim and find this information. And this will tell you exactly pretty much what to set up. So if we set our RPM to 1800, and then we set our manifold pressure, because this is for a Diamond DA40, and we're going to use that in the simulator just to keep things pretty even. But unfortunately, the Diamond in the simulator is FADEX, so I might be able to. They might have a TDI in there that isn't FADEX, so we can play with both of them. But if I were to go into the aircraft and set 1800 RPM, and we're at 4,000 feet. If I put 21.5 inches of manifold pressure, I would be burning only 5.8 gallons. So if we look at any of the best economy, that's the lowest. So technically that should hold us at level flight, and that would kind of be our best, right? But we can experiment with that, okay? And that's what we go into here, our experimental method. It's one thing to read it off a sheet, but we can probably do better. So we can remember that 5.8, okay? So many factors while in flight will impact our range. We know that. We can account for wind based on forecast, but we may not be able to know the actuals without being in the air. So on the DA40, we use a G1000, the G1000 in the simulator is only in the FADEC one, FADEC DA40, but it will show us this. This is what I use in real life. This is the exact same presentation I would use in real life, so that's why that's in there. But don't worry too much about that. We want to set our desired power settings and then verify what the value is displayed, okay? For endurance, the POH will say 45% power like we had there for best endurance. However, we may be able to maintain level flight with less power. And I'll show you how we do that experimental method. And all we're doing, I'm not going to make you write things down, which is normally what we would do. But what I want to do is just show you that we can keep pulling it back an inch at a time and find out what our actual best endurance is. This here just explains how we would do that. We'd write the manifold pressure on the left, and then we'd find the knots indicated and fill it out on the right. The lowest manifold pressure and airspeed while maintaining straight level is best endurance. That's what we're talking about. So here's just a little brief overview here of the G1000 screen. So we have our inches of manifold pressure here, our RPM, our oil pressure. And now on some aircraft, it is a little bit different, even though it's still a G1. Excuse me. But the big thing I want to show you is down here in the fuel calculator. This will actually show us our endurance and our range. How cool is that, right? So range in nautical miles, 686, endurance, 651. So it shows us all right here what our range and endurance is, and that will change based on our power settings. So just to summarize it all up here, the review is what will affect and increase weight have on endurance flight. So if we increase our weight, what will that affect in our endurance? More weight, more drag, right? How will that affect our endurance? How long we can fly? It'll just all it's really going to do is change our power settings, right? Because it doesn't matter how fast we're going. What effect does wind have on endurance flight and range flight? So we know there's no effect on endurance. Not concerned about the distance like we were talking about before. As for range, tailwind's going to give us a greater range. Headwind's going to give us our less range. All right, so with that said, I'm sorry to kill you death by PowerPoint there. I tried to keep it as quick as possible. Let's hop into the cockpit and get up in the air and play around with range and endurance. All right, guys, here we are in the cockpit of the Cessna 172. I'm going to see if the head tracker is okay for it. If it's too much, just let me know in the comments below, and we won't do it in the future. But we have a nice clear day here in Collingwood, and that's in Ontario. Charlie, November, Yankee 3. So I cut out a little bit of the taxi and all that stuff. We're just going to take off here, and we will chat up in the air. Let's get this full power. Watch the right rudder. Let's let it take a little bit, because it didn't line us up straight on the runway to when it loaded into the game here. I was going to use the Diamond aircraft, but the G1000 doesn't. It's FADEC, which that is so all your fuel and your mix, and your prop, all of that is already done for you. I really want to be able to play with the mixture control just so that this lesson gets the full effect. So a little late on the rotation there, but we're having a good time. Okay, so we are coming up here. Let's reset this. There we go. All right, coming up here. And didn't give us any flaps, so we'll just continue on up here. And I'm actually going to make this real easy on us today. And let's get rid of this. We don't need that. We don't need that. I'm not worried too much about procedures. I hope you guys don't mind. If you want to go in to learn how to use the autopilot and everything, we can definitely do that on another video. I do have one up on the 172 autopilot 4 X-Plane. Whoopsies. Normally you can just click these heading buttons and it'll bring you right to wherever you're heading. But let's just do that. We'll hit our heading bug. It's going to come up there. Let's put heading. Okay. And as for altitude, oh, it's not even going to let us go. Let's just, we can stay at 15. 15's fine. So we don't get in. Oh, we're not going to get into clouds. It's clear. Okay, we're good. We'll go up to 4,000. Okay. So 4,000, we hit this little vertical speed button. Oops, and we go nose up. My apologies there. 500 feet per minute should be fine. We're still increasing, so look at that. We'll just bump it up a little bit more. Okay, so a few things we'll go over. I'll pause my head tracker so we can look at this together. Okay, so these are the G1000s. We didn't go through on the other side. Up here is our RPM gauge, our fuel flow, our oil pressure, oil temperature, exhaust gas temperature, EGT, our vacuum pressure, and our fuel quantity, okay? And we have 0.1 hours on this engine by the sounds of it. Now, we can click our engine, lean, system. This shows all different things here, okay? So it shows our current fuel flow and our RPM. So what we're going to do is, we're not going to worry about the lean page. We're going to do it on the system page, because I think that's going to give us, that's going to give us the best information. We do have the fuel flow here, but I'm not worried about this stuff. So let's go here. This will actually give us a number, which makes it a lot easier to read. So we can see right now 17.7. Okay. I'm actually going to keep the head tracker off for now. Let's see what this does. Let's recenter here. Actually, the one reason I want it on, look at this beautiful area. This is where I get to fly over all the time. Every day I live right near here. This is our nice little Blue Mountain area, Collingwood. It's just a great spot. So, all right, we'll climb up here. Let's stop it at 3,000. Let's cut to the chase here. So at 3,000, I'm going to keep the RPMs high, and we're going to take a look at a few things, okay? Unfortunately, today I won't look too much outside until we're coming into land. We're going to do most of it inside the cockpit, so bear with me on that. We're going to be looking at this screen here. It's going to tell us all the information that we need to know right here. Okay, we're at 3,000 here. We're going to level off. Again, we're going to do this on autopilot right now. We're not going to worry about practicing our other skills at this point. I want to get this lesson done, then we will go through the rest on the way back, okay? So I want to keep your time, keep the time crunched here just so that you can get along with flying. And your time is important to me, right? So Okay, so we're level 3,000. We can see that there. Our RPM is at 2,700 and our fuel flow is 17.3. So if we want to get our, let's start with our range. Now, unfortunately, this isn't going to show our range, okay? But we know that that's going to be the most amount of distance that we can fly on a single tank of gas. Now, like I said, unfortunately, this G1000 is not optimized like a real G1000. It is totally wrong. But we'll have to make do with it, right? So endurance is going to be what we can really see here. So let's say I throttle back to cruise. A cruise power setting at 172, about 2,300 RPM. Okay. So we throttle back 2,300. And what's that done to our fuel flow? So I'm not sure if you can see too well there, but I'll zoom right in here. We're 9.8 gallons per hour. So we went from 17.7 to 9.7, 2,200 RPM. Okay, cool. Are we able to maintain straight and level flight? Yeah. So now let's throttle back. And we'll do 100 RPM at a time. This is called the experimental method, okay? So we're 2,200. It'll jump a little bit around, but 2,200. Did our fuel flow go down? It did, 8.8. We're still holding straight and level flight. Okay, good. Let's go down to 21. $2,100 RPM. 7.6, 7.5, and we're still holding straight and level flight. $2,000 RPM. Are we still holding straight level flight? Yeah, we have to adjust a little. Looks like it. Airspeed's coming down. We're now at 6.3 gallons per hour, so we're getting more or less fuel burn, right? So you can see our autopilot's trying to fight, keep us up there. Okay, I'm going to kick off the autopilot. I'm going to hand fly this from this point on, and I hope you can see this here. I'll read these numbers out to you as we go. If you can't see it, just full screen it. You should be able to see it because I can see it quite fine on my full screen right now. So, but I'll bring us in just a little. So we're letting our speed settle. Everything is holding. RPM's coming down, 1,900. Because this isn't a constant speed prop, as our airspeed goes down, our RPM is going to go down. But, let's work with it here. We'll see. We'll see if I can keep it on autopilot, actually. Okay, so 1,900. We're still able to keep straight and level flight. Fuel flow is continuing to go down. We're at 6.0. Let's get this down to 1,800 RPM. We'll know if we can't keep straight and level flight. If this starts dropping, autopilot will probably kick off on its own. Okay, so 1,800 RPM. Okay, we'll call it 1,800 there. Airspeed's coming down. We're at 73 knots, 5.1 gallons per hour. Look at our attitude now. Ooh, we're nose high. Look at the cowling is like right on the horizon here. Airspeed's coming down. We're still holding altitude, okay? And this autopilot should just keep pitching our nose up until, like we can see it getting pitched up here on our attitude indicator, until we get to a stalling speed, right? So we'll just keep this RPM coming down, 1,700. Okay. Bump it up. Let's get 1,700. Airspeed's coming down pretty rapidly. I think we're not going to be able to hold straight and level flight for much longer. But here we got 4.9. Okay. So we'll see. If we start hearing that stall warning horn come on, we're going to want to bump up our RPM because we're not going to have flaps or anything. We see our speed still trending downwards. That's what that little red mark is there. Okay, but we're 5.0 gallons per hour, 1,700 RPM. I'd probably say if we went down to 16, that we're going to start losing altitude, right? I would say this is probably the lowest we can go, might even need to bump it up. But we're at 5.0. Airspeed's coming down pretty rapidly, so let's bump it up. I think 1,800 is going to be the safest for us. A little bit of buffer room. So 1,800, let's stop our airspeed going down. We'll keep holding our altitude there, 1,800. Let's see how we sit here. So again, look at our nose high attitude, really nose high attitude. Airspeed sitting there. Okay, so we're 6.4 gallons per hour. Now, we talked about one other thing. So our power is down. We're holding straight and level flight. What else can we do to get that down? So mixture is the last thing. That's this red knob down here. And watch what happens as I pull the mixture out. See, as I pull that mixture out, well, the good old flight sim, it's not going to show us, but let's see. Oh, yeah, there we go. See how that fuel flow is coming out? See how it's coming down? We're 5.3. RPMs are changing as well, so we just need to bump them up. Keep that 1800. So electric power, keep that 1800. But we can see that our fuel flow is going down. So we were at 6.6. We're going to have to actually give it a little more power. Look at this. We're starting to get into a stall. A little more power here. Don't allow that to stall. So maybe we need to be 1900. That's fine. This is all the experimental method. This is what it's all about. Trying to see how low of an RPM you can go and keep straight and level flight. So maybe it's 1900, okay? But as we keep that mixture coming out and we have ourselves properly leaned, which depending on the aircraft is sometimes, 50 degrees lean of peak or rich of peak. It just all depends on the aircraft. Normally we do rich of peak, 50 degrees rich of peak. I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty of that, but we pull this out, fuel flow goes down. Obviously, see our RPMs dropping? We need to get that fuel back in. We're starving it with fuel. Okay. So here we are, 6.2. Obviously that's changed if I push this all the way back in. See, we're holding straight and level flight. Everything is all good. I push this back in. We're 8.5. Okay. Mixture save us 2 gallons per hour. Almost 3 gallons per hour. Fantastic. All right. That is our range. Practice it. Play with it. Get good with it. The biggest thing with it, I'm just going to rip us back here quick time, guys. Let's line this up, and then I can take that off pause. There we go. I'm just going to rip us back around here. But the whole reason that we want to go over this is so that we understand that mixed with our power and mixed with our mixture, we can get the most range or endurance out of our aircraft. Now, like I said, this G1000 doesn't show us exactly what I'd like to show you when it comes to range, but it's the same principles apply, right? We pick those power settings. We'll do it on the way back. I'll show you how we do it here. It isn't going to tell us how far we can go, but we just have to do a calculation, so it's more theoretical as opposed to a real practical application. But what we would do here, let's go 24. We want to see that we have straight and level flight. We want to be around that 1.5 times the stall speed. And that's going to kind of put us in that proper lift to drag. Put us in that proper lift to drag position there, the sweet spot. Okay, let me just turn off the flight director here. There we go. We'll just continue flying back. So stall speed on this, what were we seeing? That was around 40, so around 60 knots would be like our sweet spot in that lift to drag curve there. So we could just power down and make sure that we're still getting adequate ground speed. So we can look at here, our ground speed. Let's get this trimmed out. Come on here. Sorry, that's a little jittery here. That's flight sim with this X56 or whatever this is called. So all we're doing here is we're checking our ground speed, and we're pulling back, and what we're going to see is our ground speed or knots indicated is going to go, because they both correlate with each other, right? But we're going to lose too many knots per power, right? So for instance, let's do this. Quickly show you here. Autopilot will come on, headings on, bring us back up to 3,000 here, and I can kind of show you what I mean here. Okay, let the power come down, and we'll start right at the chase. We'll go right to 2,000 here, 2,000 RPM. Okay. I'll stop the camera moving there so that doesn't mess with your head too much, guys. But we can see here we're at 3,000 feet. We're at 76 knots at 2,000 RPM. Okay. If I pull that back to 19, we'll see we're going to go from 78 knots, and we'll see what we go down to. And I could write this down. The smart thing would be to write it down. But we'll try to remember it here. So 1900, we went from 78 knots to, what, 75 knots? So we lost 3 knots. 3 knots, 1,000 RPM. Not bad trade-off. Because when we go down 100 RPM, we're saving fuel, right? 1800. 18. Let's see how much we lose here. We've lost 4 knots already. Call it 5 knots. We lost 5 knots per 100 RPM. Let's go down to 17. So far, our least amount of gap was 19, okay? So we'll set at 17. What's that bring us down? So we're already down 3 knots. We're down 4 knots. We're down 5 knots. We're down 6 knots. So see how every 100 we take away now, we're losing more airspeed, okay? So we want to go up in 1900 is going to be our best range. So we set it at 1900 RPM. Our airspeed will come back. And then we would just lean, right? So we'd bring that back, see how our RPM is dropping. So that needs to go in until our peak RPM. Normally with Cessna 172, it's just rich of peak RPM. Okay, then we bring this back. We will go here direct. Just a little bit of extra information here on the G1000. We'll just hit, let's see if this will work here. Oh, it's good. There's no direct to button. Normally there's a direct to button on these. That's over here on this. Okay. So we'll go C, N, Y, three, enter, activate. This will show us where we need to go, hopefully. If it doesn't look like our, doesn't look like this sim likes to do that, so we'll just go direct to, enter, enter. Look at that. It's not showing us. That's good old Flight Sim 2020. It does have its limitations, especially when using flight plans. So here, let's go here, take that off. Let's kind of just get coordinated as to where we are. There's the hill. Okay, so the airport's just over there. We can see the lights. I'm just going to come in on a straight final here, guys. Okay. Well, the phone's just going off. Let me move that there so we don't have to listen to it anymore. We're going to go in on a straight final here, okay? So we're not going to do the circuits. We'll play around on the circuits the other day, but let's go put us down, okay? We've got no winds today. I have it set up in the sim like that. So we're going to fly back in the Cessna 172. What is our approach speeds? So we're going to want to be about 75. And we'll take that all the way down. Okay. Again, in future lessons, we'll go through exactly what those numbers are and how to calculate those numbers. But for this flight today, we want to be 75. And we're going to want to be at circuit altitude, which is 1,700 feet, 1,000 feet above the ground. I'm keeping the power in, guys. I'm doing this a little unorthodox because I want to get us in there. I want to save your time. But I want to also talk through a landing. So for 2,700, we'll continue our descent down. And like we said, 1,700 feet. Yeah, you can see here, this GPS is not showing us what it is supposed to be at all. Yeah, that's not where the airport is at all. That's, yeah, like I said, guys, that's the one issue with the Flight Sim 2020. It struggles with the IFR stuff. I guess you could call it IFR. I still consider that VFR. Using GPS navigation points is still VFR in my mind. You know what I could try here while we're coming in here? Let's pause that. Keep us flying in. I'm just gonna pull up my. Where are we here? Try to pull up the. track IR, and I just want to use a different profile here. Track IR. Because right now I am in what I use for DCS. Turn that off. Let's go Flight Sim 2020. Let's see if this is any better for us here. A little less drastic. There we go. Okay, so we need to get down. There's our runway. We're just going to land runway 31. Sorry, this would be runway 13. We took off 31. And what was our speed? We wanted 75 knots, right? Okay, 75 knots. And so how do we get the airspeed down, right? If I keep going down because I need to lose altitude, my airspeed's increasing, but my power's pretty low, 1700. We got to get that nose up. So the nose has to come up. Pitch controls airspeed, and power controls your altitude. So we're coming up to 80 knots here. And 2,000 feet. Get the speed down. Right, there's 80 knots. So we know our attitude's going to be around here. Okay, so now we're within the white arc. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put our flaps down, get ready for landing. We're a little high, but we're still far out, right? But look, we added flaps, and look what happened. Our airspeed's dropping. We added more drag. But if I keep my nose in this position, luckily it worked out because we're trimmed properly, but we could sit up like this, and our airspeed's going to continue to drop, right? So we got to get that nose down. We got to anticipate that. And what we could do is see how that threshold, those piano keys there, as they call it, are staying in the same spot on the windscreen. Okay, but airspeed's increasing, so we got to change it. How can we also slow down? Add more flaps. So we got 20 degrees of flaps. And we could drop the airspeed. 75 is great on final, but we know we have a lot of room before we stall, so let's get down to 60. Wow, do we look a little bit high? Yeah, let's put the 30 degrees of flaps in. So now we got 30 degrees flaps. 65 is an okay speed for us. That's what the 172 likes, 65. Okay, we got to keep this attitude, but we're coming in pretty steep, 950 feet per minute, right? That's fine. Power comes out. We're 65, looking at those numbers. Okay, we're a little bit of power, slow that descent rate. So we're going to pull up the nose a little. Now we're going to transition our eyes down the runway. A little bit of power, and the power comes right out. Eyes down the runway, hold it off the runway. Nose comes up, nice and gentle, right to those trees. Boom, touchdown. Hold the nose off. And we can brake and bring it to a stop. And there we go. That's it, guys. Easy peasy. So there is range and endurance. And next time, I should probably check, but next time it's probably going to be stalls. So we'll get into the stalls next time. Appreciate it. Thanks so much. I know this is a lengthy one. This is kind of a drinking from a fire hose type lesson, but it's a good one to know and put in the back of the mind there for all flying. So appreciate it. Thanks so much for stopping by, and catch us on the next one.